Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Phrasally Verbocious, where two geary teachers discuss the world of ELT from Spain. Morning, Alan.
Good morning to everybody.
Firstly, thank you for the comments, likes and listens we've already had online for our first episode, which was released last week on using L1 in the classroom. Sinead McMahon, cheers for thinking it was a brilliant idea. And Dave Taylor preferred A4 or A3 in the classroom as opposed to L1. I have to say it took us quite a while to work that one out.
Yeah, and Arthur McCune, who may or may not realise he's going to be on one of these podcasts in the future, was, now this is his words, glad for the opportunity to listen to rough 40 in English for 30 minutes before he went off to bed.
I should perhaps note here, Arthur and Alan's families hail from the same area of the County Antrim countryside in Ireland, which may explain the rough 40 in English, and also explain Alan's general English during the podcast.
Yeah, you'll find out in this podcast that Chris, when talking about literature, is cultured. I am agricultured. Max also got in touch and gave us his view in the L1 topic last week. He said, for me, it's essential, as everyone I've taught so far has spoken Spanish. It saves time and tells them you're in the same boat. They laugh at your mistakes, and he finds that when you ask them questions about Spanish, it makes them feel a bit special when they help you, as opposed to just you helping them, which is nice to hear.
It is. And so thanks for all the feedback. We are learning by doing, so do get in touch. And I mean it when I say we're learning by doing. The outtakes of these podcasts, and we've only had 2 so far, could fill an entire episode on their own. So on today's podcast, we're going to talk about the use of literature in the classroom, something which is both important and dear to our hearts, especially since this week is World Book Day and the births and deaths of Shakespeare and Cervantes. Alan, you have a thing for stories in the classroom?
Yeah, I love bringing stories into the classroom. I think it comes back from when I was in primary school. We used to get storytellers who would come and visit. I don't know if that was their official job title or if it was just people that wanted to tell kids stories. But these actually had quite a big effect on me because I still remember the stories they told. Like there's like why parrots are multicolored, and then there's stories that were probably adapted from more classical stories as well. I just love the ability these people had to really put these really strong, detailed images of a story into my head when I was a kid, and I thought it was fantastic. One of them, funnily enough, was, I'm sure we've all used a textbook that has the story of stone soup in it.
Oh yeah.
Which I've taught from 5 or 6 different books. So in most textbooks now, and I even used it this week. So this week I got students to act out a version of themselves in groups once we go through the original. So you get a narrator. Well, I know I was doing them in groups of 5. You get a narrator, 1 per man, and 3 people offering some form of ingredients. They get to make it up. So this week I had one including iPhone soup, so they were throwing electronics into the pot. The other one, they were making a sort of mash of different animal body parts and stuff. That was entirely their idea. So I think this way students get into stories, they get into reading much easier if you make it more exciting. And I think when they see a teacher is quite excited or really into a subject, I think it's much easier for the student to really get into what they're doing as well. I can get pretty animated when I'm telling stories, and I get quite excited when I'm doing it. So I like to bring, a lot of action, a lot of acting, and a bit of loud, because I'm not quiet. A bit of loud theatre in the room as well. I think we'll come
on to this probably later on in the pod, but I think that's really important. What we've been talking about there is that the word literature, and I'm actually going to kind of paraphrase Robin Walker actually here. The word literature can come at us with a capital L and be something scary, which I will talk about in a minute as well. But it can also come with like little l, the lowercase l, and storytelling, and that's still literature. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that it isn't just sort of Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare and Cervantes who are these literature, people.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's no way you would give James Joyce to. Well, you wouldn't give James Joyce to anybody. But I think
you can say that.
Yeah, as an Irishman, I'm allowed to say that. But there's there's a fear of the word literature in the EFL classroom because they go, here, don't want to do literature. That sounds hard and terrifying. Whereas, like, no, it's actually great fun. Let's do fee fi fo fum with smelling the blood of Englishmen and classrooms and pretending to be, giants and monsters and giant golden eggs and geese and stuff. It's a lot of fun.
Exactly. I think. See, my background is literature. You were talking about my cultured background. Thank you, Alan. I studied literature at university. I studied my master's in literature. That's what I was interested in. I spent 4 years reading dozens of books. Well, not dozens of books a week, but it felt like it. And therefore, I have the background, and I have the passion, and we can all have the passion. But I have the background that allows me to feel confident doing it. And I think that's what often can be lacking with people in the VFL. And I know that I've given presentations where I work to colleagues who perhaps come from completely different sort of educational backgrounds in terms of what their degree subjects were, and they're kind of going, oh, well, I can do that. I was like, well, yes, you're teaching EFL, you don't need to analyse the sonnet, or you don't need to analyse the poem, but you can put the poem in the classroom and get them to discuss things about it.
Yeah, I think there is that sort of fear from the sort of high school approach is, so what are the connotations of the glass on the window? It's like, no, tell a funny story with, monkeys and elephants and tigers. Because, kids want to pretend to be elephants. I like pretending to be an elephant.
I'm quite fond of pretending to be an elephant as well.
We're talking about higher levels there, and you did mention stuff you talked about to other colleagues. We worked together in the past. So I've used some stuff that you have brought into the classroom and into meetings before. Yep. Do you want to talk about Pennsylvania Station?
I can. I think I used it with C1 last year as just a change from the usual run-of-the-mill in terms of the textbook preparing for an exam, but also I'm having a bit of a... I remember when I did myself, this whole thing about authentic materials just seemed a little bit... bizarre, and like, well, things have been written purposefully in the textbook, we'll use those. But actually, I've started to see it from the other point of view, and I realised that actually giving them stuff that's real is way more exciting, and is much more like what they're going to encounter in the real world. So I have tried over the last couple of years to introduce more examples of quote-unquote authentic materials in my classroom, and that for me is often literature. Not that non-fiction isn't useful, but I kind of think that with literature they kind of get a bit of a buzz from having read something that's literature in English. And one of the examples is a novel called Pennsylvania Station by Patrick Horrigan. And I remember reading it. I was reading it for myself. I was reading for pleasure, and there was this passage that I thought, there's lots going on in the subtext here. There's lots going on that they would have to infer and deduce from what's being said. And lots that I know or I understand because I've read the previous however many pages, but is actually quite subtle. So I used it with a C1 group, and I asked them basically to figure out who was in this scene, what was going on, what could they tell me about the characters based on the evidence in front of them. And they surprised themselves, I think, by what they could infer, because they got sort of the age, the relationships, they got what was going on. Which is all stuff that for the reader who's been reading from page 1 is all obvious and accepted, but from somebody who just dives into the middle of the book was really good. And of course that's what they have to replicate in the exam, but it's a bit more interesting to use something real than something that's been written specifically to, or contrived specifically to examine students. And then you've taken it away and used it as well, haven't you, Alan?
I have, yeah. I think what you said there about like books that are designed for native speakers, I think, because I did it last year as well, and I've done it this year with B2 and C1 students. And I think the biggest surprise in doing just an excerpt from a book is the fact that they look at it and go, I got every bit of that. Nobody has had to ask about vocabulary or grammar. They understood it perfectly. And I have a sort of PowerPoint slide where once they finish reading it, they discuss a lot of questions about it.
Yeah.
And they got pretty much everything spot on from just deducing it from that. It's basically a page and a half of the entire book. And they understood it pretty much perfectly. They knew that there was obviously something wrong with the mother. They knew the number of family members. They realized it was some form of celebration or event that
Some
you
sort of
only
formal
go for
occasion.
maybe once a year, a formal occasion. It's a birthday. And they seem to pretty much work out most of the information in the text. I think because it is a novel for native speakers, people just go, "Oh, we can actually do this then." I mean, I did it with B2, and B2 were like, "Yeah, this is fine. We can get this completely." As opposed to something at first art, it's their head out of the textbook. And even though there's some textbooks I am very keen on because they go, sourced from, XYZ, sourced from National Geographic or The Guardian or whatever. But I just think it gives them a lot more confidence when, all right, the teacher has actually given us a novel to work from, and it's worked.
We were talking about L1 last week in the classroom, and I always have about 1,000,000 books on the go, but I'm working my way through El Principito in Spanish. I've actually never read it in English, and there's an absolute joy in the fact that I'm reading something that has not been designed for me.
Yeah.
And no, I'm not taking the same joy as I do from reading in English, where I'm thinking about all the connotations and how it all means all these different... No, I'm not. That's not the kind of joy I'm deriving. I'm deriving joy from reading something in Spanish that wasn't written for a learner. And that's something that we can give to our students. We can give them that joy. And I think that... Well, I know that we've got sort of fun and games coming up in the pod in a few weeks' time, but... I'm very much down for students enjoying their lessons, as well as working incredibly hard and learning stuff. That's what they're in classes for. This is not it's not football practice. This is an English lesson, but they should be enjoying it if possible as well.
I think there's a major like I remember the first time I finished my first short story. Now I read a lot of short stories in English. I have a mountain of books here, collections of short stories. I remember the first time I completed one in Spanish. That was a big deal for me. That was a serious milestone of when you finish that final page. That is a serious milestone in your language learning.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think as genuine as source information as you can is needed, because sometimes when you read it in certain textbooks, you go, this has obviously just been written for a specific grammar point, and then you look at it constructively and you go, all right, there's the grammar point, but I mean, it's garbage. Like it's not exciting anybody.
Robin Walker has given a series of talks throughout Spain on the title Language, Literature, Life Beyond the Canon. I believe it's available online, and if so, we'll post a link in the show notes. And he was talking about the problem of, okay, so we've seen the story, now let's find the grammar. Do we need to do that? No. It's the typical literature lesson in an EFL classroom of read the little extract, answer some comprehension questions, and then go, haha, there's some grammar in here that I hid for you. We don't need to do that necessarily. And sometimes we can actually just use literature for literature's sake, and we can have that joy that we're talking about.
I mean, I'm obviously from a background where I grew up reading, and I grew up, reading, well, sort of, I suppose they're the classics to, native English children. I grew up with Enid Blyton because Enid Blyton and me share the same birthday. I grew up with Roald Dahl and a lot of others as a kid.
He grew up in my city,
Oh, really?
Yeah, Roald Dahl went to school in Cardiff.
Oh, that's fantastic. I didn't know that. But in the classroom, I kind of like taking, especially with teenagers, some of them, they think of the word book and they don't get excited because it's not Netflix. I like to bring a lot of funny quotes, funny sections from, some of my favorite books into the classroom. Now, obviously, there's as wonderful a language as Roald Dahl uses, you would spend 6 months trying to explain what any words out of the BFG would actually mean. So I like starting to use for about B2 and above things like Terry Pratchett, which sort of gets me into quite excited by stuff. But I think there's a load of way of getting people into reading. In a future podcast, we'll probably talk about sort of gamifying and Teffeling, as an old employer of ours once said, which I think is quite good. So reading using, like what's in the book and showing real life details as well. One of the textbooks that I don't use it anymore, but I've used it for the last 3 or 4 years, is the Citizen Z series for teenagers, which I actually quite like because the source material they use in them is real life stuff.
Yeah.
So, all right, people go, okay, in every chapter there's a reading, to introduce the sort of grammar point.
It's very formulaic, but it's a textbook, right?
It's very formulaic as a textbook, but then you start to really appreciate it because you look the stuff up and then you realize, oh, hang on, I can base a whole class around this, and their head isn't in the textbook.
Yes.
One of the examples would be there's a reading, I can't remember, in the I think it's the A2.
The A2. It's the A2, yeah.
James May's Lego House, which means there's a documentary on YouTube, James May's House Made of Lego. James May's the guy off Top Gear. For those of us like me who don't like cars. So, first they're watching a thing on Lego houses. Everybody had Lego, makes everybody happy. So you can do a listening out of that, and then you open the textbook and there's the thing we just read about. So then they're a lot more excited into doing that class.
Yeah.
As opposed to, okay, here's a reading, here's a grammar question. It's like, you might not even do the grammar till the next class, because then you go, okay, can anybody remind me about what the video and the reading was? And they go, oh, yeah, here's the house, he sold the house, he put it all together in a couple of days, 2 floors, and talking about it.
Yeah, so even though this is something else that perhaps Robin Walker would agree with, perhaps I shouldn't speak for him, but this, like, little L literature, because this stuff about James May, obviously this is not fiction, this is something to do with something he actually did. Mm-hmm. But it's a piece of text from the real world, okay, fine, but also the way that you're talking about using it is very much what we're talking about, right? So you're looking at it as a text for its own sake, mm-hmm. and not because it contains a grammar point.
Yeah, it's a text for, here's an interesting topic. If you just see it as, Times New Roman font in a book, it's like, okay, fair enough, Lego house, there's a pretty picture.
And it hasn't, sorry, I'm interrupting you, but that's how we do these things. So it doesn't even need to be that you have comprehension questions. Mm-hmm. Because I think, again, that can also be incredibly formulaic. No, give them this text about James May's Lego house, after showing them, getting the video up, get them talking about the video, show them the text, so they read the text, they can talk about the text, and you can ask them different questions, they can ask them response questions, rather than, was there a working Lego fridge or something? I don't remember what the questions were, but I'll just scan through the text and I'll find that. Well, they practice those skills all the time. Mm-hmm. Would you like to live in a Lego house? What would be the challenges of living in a Lego house?
Yeah,
that'd be far more interesting to get them to talk about. And it's all off of this text, and they're using English and they're using the language, potentially, or potentially not. And this is something, again, I feel like our pods are going to flip, reference back and forth, like a good C1 or C2 essay should for Cambridge. So referencing back,
here's our communicative achievement coming through.
Our organisation as well, actually. So last week we talked about L1 in the classroom, and I think there's a really interesting point here is that if you let them to use their L1 to discuss something, they're going to have much better ideas because you haven't handicapped them. So it could be that you present them the questions in English. Would you like to live in a Lego house? What would be the benefits? What would be the disadvantages of living in a Lego house? You have 5 minutes. You may discuss this in Spanish. But I want your feedback in English.
Nice, yeah. I actually, because it was Lego and stuff, I actually turned it into a class for childhood toys.
Yeah.
So things that they like doing, are things they got as kids, and then because everybody, I think the entire class had Lego at some stage. Mm-hmm. I had 10 girls in one class, I had 10 boys in the other class. Everybody had Lego, and then they all had like a mix of other toys. So it became a whole toy discussion class as well. Brilliant. And it was nowhere near Christmas. It probably really should have been. It would have been perfect for about the 12th of December, I think, just to sort of get everybody excited. But no, It was just one of those things. It was great fun.
It sounds good. Can I add some more ideas? So this was I don't remember if this actually came from, I keep referencing Robin Walker, whether it came from his talk or not, but it certainly came, I was certainly inspired by this talk to think in this way, but that you don't have to be dealing with longer text, you certainly can, of course. But the very first word of Charles Dickens's, well, the first sentence, excuse me, of Charles Dickens's Bleak House is the word London. Bleak House begins, London, full stop. Now, I think it's an interesting question to ask, again, maybe not the 8-year-olds, but students studying B2, C1, C2. Okay, so Charles Dickens had the audacity to begin a novel with the word London, full stop. Why? And yeah, you are talking about connotations here and deduction and inference. What did he think that word meant? Why was that enough for a sentence when we know that a sentence really should have a verb and a subject? But this didn't. So what is that saying? Okay, how about then if we change that? Why don't we pick some cities that you're familiar with? Why not? How about if it began with Madrid, full stop? What does that mean, and how does that contrast with London? And they can be doing all this in English, and it's all inspired by literature. So you are bringing literature into your classroom because of this background. You could do it with the city that you're teaching in. You could do it with New York. You could do it with Sydney, or whatever you wanted. And I think that's a really interesting conversation about what do these places mean to people. Another thing that I do a lot of is poetry, and I do this with B2+. And basically this is all stolen from when I used to be a literature teacher or a high school English teacher in the UK. And I tend to go with GCSE set level work. The language is accessible, very accessible, and it's all about issues. So what I quite like is there's a wonderful poem, it's Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Two Scavengers in a Truck, Two Beautiful People in a Mercedes. And it's a moment. It's a wonderful poem about a moment at a at a stoplight, to use the American English, but at a traffic light in San Francisco one morning, and it just captures this moment where you've got two people in a rubbish truck, and you've got two beautiful people in their Mercedes, and it just compares the two people and how they come from completely different worlds, but for this 30 seconds of that morning, they are held together by the same light. They're held together by the same laws, the same rules, and it's a brilliant poem for getting them to look at sort of connotation, yes, and deduction and inference, but also then to discuss issues of equality, issues of inequality. I remember using it in a high school in Valencia a couple of years ago, and I think there was second bachillerato. The discussions that I had got these students having in their second, or even, I'm not going to be political here, Spanish, so they speak Spanish, they speak Valenciano, and they speak English. In English, in an L2, there we go, okay. The discussions these students were having in an additional language about equality in their own country was incredible. And that was all inspired by a poem. So I think, yeah, the thing is, you can have that. You could have like a little text in the textbook, and then you could have. And what do you think about equality in your country as being like the 5th or the 6th question on the bottom? You know, a little discussion bubble thing, or in pairs discuss. But actually, we got there from a poem. But yeah, having students discuss important ideas from a piece of literature is really interesting. The Right Word by Imtiaz Darker is brilliant. She goes through a series of nouns and indeed verbs to describe a person and their behaviour. And at the beginning, the person is outside and they're a terrorist, and by the end, she's realised that it's a child, and the child has come in, taken their shoes off, and is sat down having a meal with them. It's a very useful one for teaching writing, actually. Choosing your words carefully is really important, because terrorist and freedom fighter and guerrilla warrior and child are very different words. But they're very different meanings. It gets them discussing connotation, and it gets them discussing synonyms, antonyms, exactly. But also the shades of meaning.
Mm-hmm. Oh, shades of meaning, I like that.
Yeah, I always talk about words as having colours.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, they're both blue, but that's a darker blue.
Oh, very nice.
You know, I think that can communicate it well.
There was one thing you there was one thing you mentioned there about the use of, say, London in a sentence, or if you said a different, for because we're in Spain, it would be Madrid. There's one thing, it's sort of a verb I picked up from our school back home, is we use the word glocalize. So it's global stuff, but we've localized it. Which, if anybody knows Ireland, it's quite funny because we have changed certain contents of certain textbooks to say not even just Belfast, Dublin, or Derry, but there's the likes of Lurgan or Newry or Omagh. So it gets a wee bit strange. But what I like to do in classrooms as well is certain graded reader type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So to not sound like an advert, his name has come up before and his voice will be on this again. So back home, Arthur McKeown, who I work with, in the past had published children's books. Based on stories in Ireland. Now, I find that once students know where you're from, and if you're telling them a story of where you're from, they tend to get a lot more into it. So obviously, being from the north, we have the story of the Titanic, which the little girl survives. Let's just get that out of the way. So that they've seen pictures of the Titanic. During my St. Patrick's Day classes, they get told the story. But we do. It is a reading. It's a reading for the kids. So we go through the Titanic story. One little girl's is Mary, and then there's all the captain and all that. And then there's a couple of other stories that are a wee bit strange, like the prince coming to a little village called Park Gate. Which is apparently a big seller in South America now. So, off the top of my head, there's two guys who put up posters around this little town of Park Gate saying the king of Peru it's a South American company, I think it's Peru, is going to come to Park Gate because he wants cats, because the country has ran out of cats and they have a mouse problem. So this was an April Fool's about 200 years ago. It's a bit of I don't know if it's an urban myth or if somebody actually did it. So all of these people were told to bring their cats to the town square in Park Gate so the prince could take them back to South America. So these two boys set this up as a joke, and all these people showed up with all these cats, and they're sitting obviously up a tree watching this from a safe distance, laughing about it. The kids love stories like that. They think it's absolutely fantastic. But
and then it can be adapted, and that's the important thing, is right. So it can be adapted, and you can say, well, what other animals could we bring to the town square or the Plaza Major? What could we bring? What would happen if we brought monkeys?
Yeah.
And get them. They can make up their own little stories about. They can all choose an animal in their pairs or in their threes, and then what would be the result? Or why would they want? So cats to go to South America to catch all the mice. Okay, well, now pick a different animal. Why would you want that animal to go? So you're always bringing the literature into the classroom, and then you're using it to take you somewhere else.
Yeah, and then I like you just said, I do like putting do their own version of the story as well, because some of the stories I've heard this year have just been phenomenal. They've been unbelievable. So, like for example, in the classroom a couple of weeks ago. Which has become a running joke in class. Some of my teenagers took it when we did a create your own version of the story, created their own story about two scientists in Antarctica were trying to make penguins fly by expanding their wings. It gets better. So one scientist decided to leave the room to get a cup of coffee. And the other scientist continued working.
Right.
By the time the other scientist came back from his cup of coffee, the other scientist had killed 7 of the penguins, who then decided to escape and run away so he wasn't framed for the murder of many endangered emperor penguins. And the fact that they just created this all in 10 minutes, and it was incredibly funny, and it's sort of become a running joke in class and all, it's really, really good fun.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us back to that wonderful word fun, which we're going to come back to in a few weeks. So I think that brings us to the end of this podcast on literature in the classroom. As you can imagine, there's plenty more we could have said. This has been a fairly packed podcast. You can join in the conversation with us on Twitter at
Phrasally V on Twitter.
Okay, where we'll also be posting some other suggestions, things that we didn't have room for in the pod today, text you can use, etc. Also, you can leave us a rating or a comment on whatever podcasting service of choice you use.
We should hopefully be appearing on all of them by the time this podcast goes out.
Well, that's very exciting.
On our blog spot, which we will link through on Twitter, it will have links to all of the podcasting services of your choice.
And if you want to email us, you can email us at
Verbocious@gmail.com.
Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Goodbye.